Greetings all CHP listeners everywhere in the world. Thanks for tuning in to the China History Podcast. Laszlo Montgomery here with Part 5 in this overview of the history of Singapore. For the past 4 episodes, we've been looking at the development of Singapore from its bumpy founding back in 1819 up to the mid to late 19th century. Let me quickly interject here once again. I welcome all of you to please consider supporting me in this long-running family program by subscribing to Patreon or the CHP Premium service. They heard this episode a few months ago, and without the ads, some of you abhor. It's a little uncomfortable for me to appeal to all of you, but please consider. You have no idea how costly it is to support as many cats as I do, both inside and outside my house. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened, which shortened the sailing distance to Singapore by a third, from 12,000 to 8,300 miles. And with an express train from London to a Mediterranean port, what once took months could now be done in 23 days. Today, of course, you could fly Singapore Airways, London to Singapore in 12 to 14 hours. Everything happened so fast. Steam engines and all the applications that use them for power were on full display in Singapore. The vessels and all the necessary heavy equipment at the port, telegraphs and undersea cables provided instant communication with all other major Asian ports. And in 1871, the first submarine cable between Singapore and London went operational. In the 1870s and 80s, the port saw explosive growth thanks to everything happening up in Malaya and the continued expansion of global trade. Let me quickly mention the Tanjong Pagar Dock Company. Today, Tanjong Pagar is an area of Singapore just below Chinatown. The company was founded in 1864 to replace the original port at the mouth of the Singapore River. This new location had a nice, roomy, deep-water port where vessels of almost any size could load and unload cargo and obtain any needed repairs or maintenance. Tanjong Pagar, in time, quickly became a bustling district as workers who sought employment at the new port settled nearby with their families. But by the 1860s, when demand exceeded the old port's capacity, this place, called New Harbor at first and later Keppel Harbor, ensured Singapore remained the most important shipping port in the whole region. As the 1800s came to a close, international shipping was seeing a spectacular rise, led, of course, by advances in steam-powered vessels. Joining the usual suspects calling at the port of Singapore were French, German, Scandinavian, and Japanese shipping companies. No longer was Singapore's port just a small harbor at the mouth of the Singapore River. By the turn of the century, it was already one of the most technologically advanced ports in the world. In 1905, the port became too important and critical to Singapore's well-being. It couldn't be left in the hands of a single corporation and self-serving shareholders who didn't care about how the sausage was made. In 1912, the government, under the auspices of the Straits Settlement Port Ordinance, established the Singapore Harbor Board to operate the Port of Singapore. Electrification began in Singapore in 1878, first at the new port at Tanjong Pagar and later in 1906 throughout the city center. And in 1879, telephones started appearing in Singapore. With the spread of telegraph networks, modern banking was born, and business decisions could be made using information and data learned practically in real time. Singapore kept going from strength to strength, and all the great men of the day, European and Asian, were earning profits as great as those being earned in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. Another massive commodity joined gambier, pepper, copra, gutta percha, and tin as the next big Singaporean export, and this was rubber. The rubber tree, Hevea brasiliensis, as the name suggests, is native to the Amazon region in Brazil. The Europeans knew of this substance since the 1730s, but it wasn't until the seeds of these trees were smuggled out of Brazil by British explorer Henry Wickham in 1876 that our story begins. Prior to that, in 1839, a process known as vulcanization had been invented by Thomas Hancock and Charles Goodyear. This process bound the long polymer chains of natural rubber into a substance that was more elastic, durable, resistant to abrasion, and able to maintain its molded shape. And as gutta percha was discovered just in time for the age of telegraph and telephone technology, the discovery of vulcanization of rubber came along with the invention of a self-propelled vehicle powered by an internal combustion engine in 1886. This invention by Carl Benz preceded the 1908 invention of Henry Ford's Model T. Seeds had been secreted out of Brazil like tea seeds in China and sent to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, London. After a couple decades of experimentation and development, some of the seedlings were sent to Malaya for further experimentation. In 1877, prior to the first commercial rubber plantation in Malaysia, established in 1896 at Kuala Kangsar in Perak State, 9 seedlings were brought over by Henry Ridley, who became director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens in 1888. Henry Ridley was the driving force behind the development of the first rubber plantations in Malaya. It started on 43 acres of land in Malacca and spread to Perak and then to Selangor, Negeri Sembilan, and Johor, where the climate and soil were perfect to propagate the species. It had been Tan Tock Seng's grandson, Tan Che Yen, who led this effort to get Malaya's first rubber plantation off the ground. A lot of Singapore's richest got into this business, especially as the demand for pneumatic tires exploded with the birth of the automobile industry. There wasn't much interest at first, and plantation owners were focused on growing coffee and sugar in Malaya and Sumatra. But after a blight wiped out the coffee crop and sugar became too competitive, Henry Ridley allowed growers to see the potential of rubber. And the biggest downside was that from the time you planted the seeds and the latex started flowing, well, it took 6 years. So to make lemons out of this lemonade, plantation owners came up with the idea to plant pineapples in between the rows of growing rubber trees. The pineapples grew relatively fast, and there was a natural synergy between the pineapple harvest and the canning industry that came in the wake of the discovery of tin. In time, Singapore would become the second largest exporter of canned pineapple to the world, second only to Hawaii. Scottish veterinarian John Boyd Dunlop invented the first practical air-filled rubber tire in 1888. They were initially developed for bicycles, but once the automobile started to gain traction, these pneumatic tires were adapted for automobiles. A pneumatic tire offered a much more pleasant ride than the tires initially produced from solid rubber and metal. His Dunlop Tire Company patented the technology in 1898. Within a decade, in order to meet the world demand, every state in Malaya was growing rubber. By 1915, rubber surpassed tin as the Straits Settlement's #1 commodity. Into the early 20th century, these Asian rubber barons put the Brazilians out of business. And between 1905 and 1914, 9 years, Malay rubber exports through the port of Singapore went from 104 tons to 196,000 tons. Not only did they supply about half the world's tin, the same went for rubber as well. Electric trams came to Singapore in 1886, but they were a more expensive mode of transport compared with the rickshaws invented in Japan in 1868. Once these rickshaws started showing up in Singapore, they quickly became quite popular. The first one showed up in Singapore in 1880 and went on to create yet another great leap forward in Singapore society. It was the car of its day. You didn't have to be a millionaire to ride one. When it rained, which was quite often, the hood could be pulled up to protect passengers from the downpour, and the rickshaw pullers paid some boss 8 to 10 cents a day plus 25% of the take to rent a rickshaw. At a rate of about 6 cents per mile, no one was getting rich pulling a rickshaw, but the ones renting them out sure did. Like hired drivers in our day, These rickshaw pullers also had to put up with cheats and disgruntled customers who ripped them off, and in some cases, some rickshaw pullers even lost their life. The pullers had access to the same opium that all the poorest laborers had, no matter in the mines, the plantations, at the port, or wherever coolie labor could be found. Since the time of Farquhar, the opium trade had been simply too profitable to walk away from, and the market of customers always remained plentiful. No matter the damage done to society, the lives ruined, and families wrecked, the government and everyone along the supply chain couldn't give it up. Profits from opium sales had more to do with Singapore's success in the 19th century than many would care to admit. The Chinese controlled the business, and the Singapore government was complicit in the sales and distribution. The next major commodity after rubber that acted as yet another rocket booster to the Singapore economy was oil. In Singapore, the genesis was in 1891 when a company that became known as Shell Transport supplied kerosene out of a warehouse in Pulau Bukham, or Bukham Island. They set up operations in Indonesia after oil was discovered there. In 1911, Shell and Royal Dutch Petroleum Company merged into Royal Dutch Shell. Just filled my tank up with their gas yesterday. Bukham Island became a storage hub for oil to be refined and then shipped to global markets, mostly in Europe at first. Today, Bukham Island is one of the many jewels in Singapore's heavily encrusted commercial crown. Today, it's one of the most significant oil refineries in the world, and though most people have no idea, thanks to the operation that grew in today's massive storage and refining complex, it made Singapore one of the leading global oil refining and petrochemical hubs in the world, refining over 500,000 barrels per day at the facilities there. By the turn of the century, Britain's Southeast Asian colonial holdings included the Strait Settlements, the Federated Malay States, and Unfederated Malay States. The head office was located in Singapore. The Federated Malay States included Perak, Selangor, Negeri Sembilan, and Pahang. A British resident resided there and was essentially the top colonial figure there. The unfederated Malay states, where the sultans held more control over their internal affairs, still kept certain political ties to Britain. In 1948, as we'll see, they all combined together to form the Federation of Malaya. Last episode, I mentioned Sultan Abu Bakr of Johor. He reigned 1862 to 1895. Very consequential years for not only Johor, but all of Malaya. The British held him in very high esteem and worked closely with him to maintain stability and to further develop and integrate Malaya and Singapore. This included infrastructure projects and agreements that protected Malay interests and helped maintain a balance of power that was good for everyone. He was the greatest modernizer of 19th century Malaya. He was made a Maharaja of Johor in 1868, when the British tried to muscle in on his authority in Johor by demanding to install a resident there. Well, he got on a steamship and sailed to London in 1884 to express his objections and was able to get the British to back down on this. However, later on in 1913, the Sultan Ibrahim of Johor will reluctantly accept a British advisor. Whilst in Britain, Sultan Abu Bakr not only got to meet the Queen, but she became a personal friend to him. He was the darling of British royalty and aristocracy, who all loved to hobnob with him during his state visits. His Malay constituents weren't so hip on his close relationship with the Brits, and this dogged him from time to time. The British basically used this Singapore-Johor relationship as the main instrument, for lack of a better word, to maintain control over British Malaya. Sultan Abu Bakr was Britain's partner in a way. The Brits used him as a conduit to better control or exploit Malaya. And as for Abu Bakr, he used Britain and Singapore to shore up his supremacy as the most consequential ruler on the peninsula. The colonial authorities made him a Maharaja in 1866, but the big prize was in resurrecting the title of Sultan of Johor in 1885. But for all he did, he's remembered as Bapa Pemodenan Johor, the father of modern Johor. Singapore's population kept growing. In 1871, there were maybe 97,000 people. In 1897, that number hit 200,000. There were two Singapores thriving side by side. The colonial portion was where the government, business, and financial center was located, as well as all the banks and retail emporiums. And then there was everything else: Chinatown, Kampong Glam, Serangoon Road, Little India, Arab Street, and all the other smaller enclaves. Over on Bukit Timah Road, across from Bougainvillea Park, where several of Singapore's educational institutions are located, is the Tan Kah Kee MRT, or Mass Rapid Transit Station. That's a subway of Singapore. And I'd like to quickly introduce Tan Kah Kee, or Chen Jiakeng. He was a Hokkien Chinese from Xiamen who came to Singapore in 1890 as a 16-year-old youngin'. His father ran a rice business in Singapore, and that's where he got started. And the business went bust, and Tan, an entrepreneur's entrepreneur, was an early entrant in the rubber industry. He joined others in creating fortunes, building plantations in Malaya, and selling rubber to overseas markets. He expanded in a number of other lucrative businesses and became one of the richest men in Singapore. By the 1920s, he was called the Henry Ford of Malaya. Tan Kah Kee is credited with trying to unite the disparate linguistic groups by promoting education in Guanhua, or Mandarin Chinese. He was also known as Singapore's father of modern education. It had been the hope of Stamford Raffles that Singapore would become a highly educated and enlightened place. Well, that ended up taking a back seat for half a century while other matters were prioritized. But Tan Kah Kee, he put education at the center of his philanthropic efforts, and not just in Singapore. In 1919, his $4 million endowment helped fund Xiamen University, which opened in 1921. And also in his hometown of Xiamen, he founded Jimei University. And UC Berkeley grads might remember Tan Kah Kee Hall on University Drive across from the Hearst Mining Circle. He went on to donate money to fund the establishment of many other schools. And as we get deeper into the 20th century, we'll see Tan Kah Kee was also a huge supporter of the KMT and did so much to aid China following the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War in July 1937. So much did he do to aid the nationalist government in its hour of need when the Japanese came calling in Singapore in 1942. He had to leave town to avoid capture. Hong Kong residents who keep their money in Chiyu or Geo Bank might be interested to know Tan Kah Kee founded that financial institution in 1947. So let me rewind for a second and talk about the 1888 veranda riots in Singapore. Back in Stamford Raffles' day, part of his grand vision of the layout of Singapore town was the idea of covered walkways. He had written in his town plan, quote, "A still further accommodation will be afforded to the public by requiring that each house should have a veranda of certain depth, open at all times as a continued and covered passage on each side of the street." End quote. Essentially, these neutral, covered walkways were meant to serve the public as a place to walk underneath to avoid the sunlight and the rain. Most of these shop houses comprised a ground floor shop and a residence above that extended outwards towards the street, which not only increased the square footage of their homes, but also created these sheltered walkways below. In the old paintings of late 19th century Singapore, you could see these structures. The Dutch had the same architectural design going on in Indonesia at Batavia. They were supposed to be 5 feet wide, but varied in length. It was an ideal place to walk in times of bad weather. In no time at all, these walkways became lined with street hawkers selling their goods and services. Shop owners also used the space to store goods, and homeless beggars, also found these walkways an ideal spot to hang all day and sleep at night. They could also be found in Malaysia, Indonesia, in Hong Kong, southern China, as well as in Taiwan. In Malaya, they called these 5-foot walkways kaki lima. I checked Google Translate, and it said kaki lima meant sidewalk. In Chinese, they were called wujiaoqi. Not everyone was fond of these architectural touches and resented the hassle of having to navigate the obstructions. It all came to a head in 1888 when the government took action to clear the walkways. The matter of who owned this space had always been a little ambiguous. Shop owners viewed the space as an extension of their property, and they'd even leased the space in front of their shop to small-time vendors. And as I said, some people with nowhere else to go would just lay down some newspaper or a woven mat and hang there as their place of residence. These street hawkers supplying goods and services inside these busy walkways were like the dollar stores to the poorer classes of people. Yeah, they were a nuisance and cluttered the aisle, but on the other hand, they had all the things you needed to pick up on your way home. And if you wanted your fortune told, they had that too. So you can get the picture. With no laws governing these spaces, everyone had their own interpretation of what was okay and what wasn't. And the Straits Settlements authorities tried to deal with it in the 1870s, but were met with a lot of pushback. So in 1888, the colonial government went in and began to start enforcing some sort of order to clear out the walkways in Chinatown. And it was met with no small amount of violent response. And when you start messing with people's livelihoods, they're known to get that way. Well, we've all seen the movies and read the books. When the man used a little too much force, it led to 3 days of rioting. The government, as it always had to do in times like this, called on the Chinese community elders who had enough face to go talk to the people and calm the waters and seek out a compromise solution. For more than half a century, the government allowed Singapore to develop naturally. They moved in when necessary, when public order was put in danger. But with these veranda riots of 1888, this represented the first time the government went in and said to the people, "We know what's best," and enforced the rules strictly. Nobody died, but a lot of people got hurt, and there was quite a substantial loss of property. It was indicative of the highly flammable ethnic tension lying just below the surface of Singapore's multiracial, multi-ethnic society. I wanted to mention another renowned Chinese resident of Singapore. This was Hu Ah-kei, or Hu Ya-chi. He was neither Hokkien nor Teochew. Hu Ya-chi came from the Guangzhou area, from the town of Huangpu. Huangpu in Chinese history is best known for its Huangpu Junxiao, or Whampoa Military Academy, founded in 1924. That was where Hu Ya-chi was from, and he acquired the nickname of Mr. Whampoa around town. He lived 1816 to 1880 and moved to Singapore in 1830, aged 15. He made a fortune in land speculation and from the many businesses he engaged in. He spoke English and was very plugged in to the European community and was very much deferred to. Of Singapore's 19th century Chinese, Hu Ya-chi was probably the most politically engaged from this community. Hu Ya-chi is also remembered as the one who made Singapore's botanic gardens happen. In 1859, he donated 32 hectares, or 79 acres, of land to the Singapore Agro-Horticultural Society in exchange for a small plot of land at Boat Quay. Today, this spectacular public garden that Mr. Whampoa helped establish is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Mr. Whampoa, Hu Ah-kei, was the first Chinese to become a member of the Legislative Council and was later made an extraordinary member of the Executive Council. In his prime during the 1850s to 70s, he was one of the main go-to guys with the Straits Settlement authorities, who they depended on as a respected intermediary to the greater Chinese community. He also served as diplomatic consul to China, Russia, and Japan. Hu Ah-kei, Hu Ya-chi, he lived quite an extraordinary life, and despite being among the wealthiest Singaporeans of his time, he was quite approachable. He used to open up his beautiful estate on Serangoon Road, known as Whampoa House, for people to visit, and had a celebrated garden called Nansheng Hua Yuan. By 1871, the population of Singapore was just under 100,000, and by the turn of the century, the number grew to 200,000. No longer was Singapore limited to north and south of the river. It had spread out to the north and to the west. Suburbs started popping up, and by the turn of the century, tourism started becoming a more common thing. The Armenian Sarkis brothers, Martin, Tigran, Avit, and Arshak, opened the Raffles Hotel in 1887. I stayed there 99 years later in 1986, just before the big renovation happened, and I had my Singapore sling at the Long Bar and raised a toast to Mr. Yen Chong Wen, better known as the drink's creator, Nyam Tong Boon. And as the jungles were cleared and housing developments built, it meant less and less habitable land for Panthera tigris, better known as the Malayan tiger. You've all seen his picture on bottles and cans of tiger beer. There's still 80 or 100 of them left on this planet. But in 1820s and 30s Singapore, they were the kings and queens of the jungle. And when these imported laborers and their machetes began hacking away at the fringes of the jungle, they inevitably ran into these magnificent animals. They got up to 200 or more pounds, smaller than Panthera tigris africanus, the African tiger, who can get up to 500 or more pounds. 200 pounds, 500. In one-to-one combat, without a firearm, a tiger will win against a human 100% of the time. They were ferocious, and Singapore was filled with them. They had been part of the ecosystem going back since before Temasek, and plenty of these Malayan tigers swam across the Strait of Johor to make their home in the Lion City. Although it probably happened many times before, the first recorded tiger attack on a human in Singapore was in 1831. By the 1840s, it was practically an everyday occurrence. They weren't the first species of animal hunted to extinction, but organized efforts were made to eradicate this menace from Singapore. It took till the 1950s to extirpate them from Singapore. That's a $64 word for cause to be extinct in a specific location, but where they still existed elsewhere. The last tiger shot and killed in Singapore was in 1930 or 1932. I'm happy to say the Malaysian government today is taking all kinds of positive steps to implement conservation strategies that will ensure the survival of the Malayan tiger. One of the legendary stories concerned a tiger that was shot and killed right underneath the bar and billiards room of the Raffles Hotel. This was in October of 1902. It had escaped from a traveling circus that was set up on the far end of Beach Road. That's part of early 20th century Singapore lore, and it's a story that's been told I don't know how many times before.
Geico makes it easy to get affordable renter's insurance in as little as 90 seconds. And then you'll start to wonder why everything else isn't so fast. Like, why does it take so long to do the dishes? A meal that's gone in 3 requires 45 minutes worth of dishes. Doesn't make sense. But it does make sense to get renter's insurance through Geico. That way, that pile of dirty dishes and the other things you love are covered. Get more with Geico.
Do you love watching 90 Day Fiancé, but you're extremely uncomfortable about it because it's embarrassing as hell, and your partner and friends want to throw up in their mouths when you talk about it?
Subscribe to the only podcast that takes this train wreck sort of seriously and generally fails to do so.
Starring a fat weirdo who lives in the woods and a forgetful, dumb mom brain, you'll love not understanding any of our 6 years of inside jokes as we tear apart these complete psychopaths, fulfilling your desperate need for a parasitic podcast relationship.
Subscribe to 90 Day Fiancé Cray Cray today, wherever you get podcasts.
So we come to the 20th century. Let's take stock of the situation. Had I delved deeper another layer or two and included more detail on social aspects of Singapore and what was happening in Malaya, we'd be on part 15 or 20 by now. One of the hazards of history podcasting is that, well, some of you are only looking for a nice bento box and some want the whole 10-course meal. So I have about 8 or 9 books and 100 websites bookmarked, as well as a sizable amount of academic papers I downloaded. And And each time I get comfortable in my CHP man cave, I'm often torn on whether to include certain information or not. Well, since 1819 at least, Singapore's story was quite spectacular. Sure, there were hiccups and a lot of blood spilled over money and competition between the varied ethnic and linguistic groups, but once the foundation was all dug and construction began, Singapore had one spot of good fortune after another. We saw how the discovery and exploitation of global commodities like gambier, spices, copra, tin, rubber, petroleum all transformed Singapore economically. Concurrently, the world saw advances in all kinds of new technologies that in our day are so mundane and even obsolete in many cases. But back then, these advances in steam-powered ships, telegraphs, telephony, in new materials, automobiles, and the proliferation of educational institutions, these all combined to jolt Singapore into a very unique position, and they always had that one thing that was Singapore's greatest gift, its perfect location. In 1911, following what happened in Wuchang on October 10th, it had quite an impact on Singapore. There was no love lost between the colonizers and the colonized. Like most governments, what the British exhibited in Singapore was everything from brilliance to incompetence. There were heroes and villains throughout the 92 years between the founding in 1819 and the fall of the Qing dynasty. But as we've seen, as far as taking advantage of every opportunity that came their way, Singapore, by the end of the 19th century, was not only vital to Great Britain, they were also a very important cog in the wheel that made the world go round, and they weren't even a country yet. That was still more than half a century in the future. That great port and all the infrastructure of the island and all the ways that it was fully flanged with Malaya to the north, all of this, coupled with its extraordinary entrepreneurs who took risks, built business empires, and assumed leadership positions in their communities, in their industry, and within Singapore itself, all of this together put Singapore on the course it now enjoys today. In 1923, the Johor Causeway opened, which for the first time connected Singapore to Malaysia. Now automobiles, trucks, and trains could get from anywhere in peninsular Malaysia and proceed non-stop to the processing plants and then on to the port for shipment. We'll talk much more about this later in the series, but Lee Kuan Yew was also born in that same year. He'll have a pretty substantial impact on Singapore, to put it mildly. Kang Yo-wei became a major visitor to Singapore after the Empress Dowager put her powerful foot down and pulled the plug on all the reforms he championed with the Guangxu Emperor. When the 100 Days Reform movement abruptly ended, Kang moved his headquarters to Singapore, and he became a regular visitor there, and he was a most popular figure. Not everything, but a lot of what he was calling for resonated with the upper and lower class Chinese. He put a lot of revolutionary ideas in people's heads, and the local community, never a terribly political force to be reckoned with, started to change. Sun Yat-sen, too, he also visited. The Malay and Singaporean Chinese, also called the Nanyang Chinese, they were very generous with Sun, and in 1906 opened up a chapter of his Revolutionary Alliance, or Tongmeng Hui, in Singapore. As we recall from history, Sun Yat-sen was a rather polarizing figure, and not everyone was on board with him and his particular revolutionary ideas. In Singapore, there were perhaps as many anti-Sun elements as there were supporters. The Qing government set up a consulate in Singapore in 1876, and the important thing to note is that the quashing of the 100 Days Reform and all the new ideas that came out of that movement took root in Singapore. From here on out, Singaporean Chinese will slowly begin to organize in new political ways rather than the traditional ways that were tied to clans and whether they came from Chaozhou, southern Fujian, Guangzhou, or Hainan. During the First World War, Singapore didn't see any fighting. That wasn't an Asian war, though it did have consequences there. Singapore's role was to serve as a military base and a logistics center, and most of the troops coming from Australia and New Zealand transited in Singapore. Britain was already just starting to create a naval base in Singapore to use to project power in the region and to defend against potential attacks. As I've indicated, Singapore processed and exported a heck of a lot of rubber, tin, and petroleum, three extremely critical commodities required for the war effort. During the war, there was quite a significant disturbance in Singapore. It's a well-documented event in history and has been studied and analyzed quite extensively. But to give you the Cliff Notes version, there was a regiment of Indian soldiers sent to Singapore that served there as the 5th Light Infantry. And they starred in the mutiny of the 5th Light Infantry. This event is also called the 1915 Singapore Mutiny and the 1950 Sepoy Mutiny. A sepoy was an Indian soldier who served in the army of a European colonial power. Sepoy is derived from the Persian word sipahi. Though there were underlying problems that played a role in the mutiny, most of these sepoys were Muslim, and they heard a rumor that they were being shipped out to go fight in World War I and that they'd be firing on fellow Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. The truth was that they were only being shipped off to Hong Kong to relieve another regiment. And acting on these rumors, they began rioting on February 15th, 1915. This was right in the middle of the Chinese New Year, so it caught everyone kind of off guard. It only lasted a couple of days, but having hundreds of armed soldiers on the loose, killing indiscriminately, was very frightful to the local residents. Marines from several countries had to be called in to suppress the mutiny. And suppressed it was on February 20th. Around 40 people were killed, mostly soldiers, but a few civilians as well. And after the inquiry and after the court-martial, justice was meted out. And the war continued, and Singapore went back to playing its important role in the fight against the Kaiser. But like these things often are, it was a watershed moment, and a clear message was sent to the British colonial authorities. Following the end of World War I, America began its rise as the world hegemon, and Britain began to slip a little. There was no Thucydides trap dynamic happening that many point to today with the U.S. and PRC, but the U.S. was on the rise, and so was its importance as a trade partner in Singapore. Oil replaced coal as the fuel of choice to power all the latest mechanical technologies, including ships. I already mentioned about Shell Oil's operations on Pulau Pukam, but Singapore had other offshore islands as well, and they made up part of the infrastructure that not only turned crude oil into fuel oil, kerosene, and gasoline, it provided storage as well. Yeah, this was when big oil came into its own, and there was Singapore, once again, with its unique location, perfectly positioned with its deepwater port, to take advantage of this change in the global energy industry, just like with gutta percha, tin, and rubber. In June of 1916, right in the middle of World War I, and 3 months after his disastrous decision to restore the emperorship, Yuan Shikai died. And if you read my book or listened to the 10-part series on the warlord era, you'll know China's next 10 years were chaotic and violent. While there were plenty of opportunities for many companies to rake in profits from the disunity there, Singapore's investors turned away from China and put their money into domestic and regional industrial projects, and this gave no small jolt to the economy and future prosperity of not only Singapore, but Southeast Asia as well. There was also this huge elephant in the room who everyone saw but dared not speculate its next move. We've all studied the backstory and recall the stepping stones that led to this moment for Singapore and Greater Asia, not to mention the Western imperialist powers. July 8, 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry and his 4 vessels sailed into Tokyo Bay, demanding Japan open its doors and allow for trade. Then came the 1868 Meiji Restoration and the abolition of the Japanese feudal system with its samurai and daimyo class. Then came the Iwakura mission of 1871 to 1873. After 2 centuries of splendid isolation, Japan went out into the world to see what they were missing. And this prompted the government to carry out modernization, invest in industry, ramp up its military, and establish educational institutions along the Western model, with Japanese characteristics, of course. Then, 1894, 1895, years that will live in infamy, Japan trounced China in the First Sino-Japanese War. And then 4 years later, 1904, 1905, Japan once again shocked the world by making fast work of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. And in 1910, for good measure, Japan annexed Korea as well. And during the Great War, while Europe was embroiled in conflict, Japan went window shopping across Asia, and the militarists in power started to come up with a few ideas about how to take advantage of this changing global dynamic. In 1932, they dropped out of the League of Nations. And as I said, between the warlord era and all the tragedy and violence that followed, Japan began to appear extremely menacing. You see, all this time, the focus on Japan had been limited to the commercial threat they caused everyone when they threw their hat in the ring and joined in the competition of global trade and commerce. So what did all this mean for Singapore? When the Japanese first came calling, it didn't take long at all for their manufacturing, their culture of sales and service, and the aggressiveness that became part of the Japanese legend began to have a seismic impact on business as usual. And for the first time in history, at least going back to the 16th century, the European nations who went and colonized so much of Asia began to feel very threatened. Following World War I, Britain, France, and of course Germany were financially strapped, and with less resources than they would have liked to have had, the Europeans could see a new age was dawning, one in which they would no longer play the dominant role. The Japanese companies were extremely interested with what was going on in Singapore. And in 1931, when the Mukden incident or Manchurian incident happened on Joyiba 918, a lot of people in the Lion City and elsewhere too began to wonder, where was this all leading? By the roaring 1920s, the world had moved light years beyond whatever Raffles, Farquhar, Crawford, and all the early founding fathers and business tycoons ever dreamed of. Air travel was in its infancy, but would advance quickly. The 1919 May 4th movement that followed the Treaty of Versailles led to a political awakening across China and Greater China that impacted a lot of students, workers, and intellectuals. And the scent of revolution and change was in the air like never before. And everyone who was pining for change would get their wish, whether they wanted it or not. The British government, after taking stock of the situation, decided the best course of action, despite the exorbitant cost, would be to construct military installations in Singapore that could serve as their fortress in Asia. The site chosen for this ambitious project was in the north of the island, facing the Johor Strait, at a place called Sembawang. Today, Sembawang is known for its hot spring park, its beach, and a massive residential development with a splendid shopping mall. But back in the 1930s, it was all jungles and swamps. But with a huge investment and a Herculean effort, an incredible state-of-the-art naval base was built. The largest warships of the day would have plenty of room to maneuver. It had luxury and comfort along with the wharves, dry docks, cranes, storage facilities, roads, rail lines, power stations, and all the associated infrastructure that went along with that. Nothing of this scale had ever been seen before in Singapore. Considering Britain's relatively empty pockets compared to the good old days, it was quite a project to take on. But the way the powers that be saw it, the British Empire was at stake. Therefore, there was no price too high to pay to preserve what they had enjoyed since about the 17th century. I'll spare you the superlatives and just say that it was a magnificent structure, with unprecedented firepower, it truly would strike fear into any enemy vessel that dared to approach. The Japanese took note of that, and when Sembawang Naval Base opened in February 1938, the Japanese High Command decided no way they were going to walk into that buzzsaw. Singapore Governor Sir Shenton Thomas said of the naval base at Sembawang it was a, quote, great enterprise of peace. The naval base is not a challenge to war. It is an insurance against war, a symbol of the care in which the mother country has for the welfare of her people and the protection which she will afford to them in time of need, end quote. In the Museum of Military Misjudgments, you could see it displayed next to the Maginot Line. Nonetheless, it was a heck of a base. When Governor Thomas said times of need, he wasn't kidding. In Singapore, Japan's great rise started off as an exporter of better and cheaper textile fabrics, but they had moved on from there to become equally adept at making bombs, torpedoes, aircraft, guns, and naval vessels of all shapes and sizes. And on July 7, 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War exploded, and everyone who was paying attention at the time had an inkling about what was coming next. And just as the Sembawang Naval Base opened, the Japanese military was starting to spread its talons. And with all the latest propaganda behind the greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere being disseminated, it was a tense time. But many optimists remain hopeful, and to serve the budding civil airline industry, Kallang Airport opened in June 1937, and this served as Singapore's main airport till 1955. Amelia Earhart flew into the airport 2 days before it opened and gave it very high marks. A couple weeks later, her plane disappeared somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. As the years passed, the British Military High Command became so certain that if Japan was going to attack Singapore, they'd do it by sea, coming from the south. After all, if they were going to invade from the north, from Malaya, they'd have to slash through too much jungle and impassable terrain. It's hard enough for one person to do, let alone 30,000. But that's what they did. On foot and atop thousands and thousands of bicycles, just like Hannibal and his elephants across the Alps in 218 BC. The Romans didn't see that coming, and when the Japanese came 21 and a half centuries later, neither did the British. The British had to blow up the Johor Causeway, but that hardly stopped the rapid Japanese advance. They had that structure rebuilt in no time at all and continued on their merry way. Aerial bombing of Singapore by Japanese Mitsubishi bombers had started on December 8th, 1941. Thousands died. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had put all his military assets in Europe to defend against Hitler. In Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, and New Zealand, they were going to have to face whatever Japan threw at them alone. No cavalry was going to come to their defense. Such a great naval base they had built. Too bad it lacked a navy and enough planes to provide air cover for their most powerful vessels. The battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse and 4 other destroyers had the misfortune to become additional naval vessels sunk by Japanese aerial dive bombers. February 8th, 1942, that was the date they rode into Singapore, and over the period of a week, they took the place over. Of all the jewels in Britain's overseas crown, Singapore was the most valuable. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered on February 15, 1942, the first day of the Year of the Horse. Because he had chosen to surrender and not fight to the last man as Churchill had ordered, it's very likely that the residents of Singapore were spared the horrors of what the Japanese army inflicted on Nanjing in December 1937. And Japan took it over in what some have said the greatest defeat in the history of the British Empire, not to mention the largest surrender of British troops. When the Japanese came in and took the place over, the British and Commonwealth troops were caught on their back foot, and despite great moments of heroism, through a series of blunders and miscalculations, Japan prevailed. And there was no Dunkirk in Singapore or any hopes for rescue. 80,000 British, Australian, Indian, and Malay troops surrendered. And when we pick up next time in Part 6, we'll see what happened immediately after the British forces surrendered. I hope you'll consider coming back. Until then, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California. Please take it upon yourself to consider coming back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.